Miranda Barbour. In Pennsylvania in November 2013, a man responded to an advertisement on Craigslist offering companionship services. Troy LaFerrara, 42 years old, arranged to meet with the person who had posted the listing. On November 11th, he got into a vehicle driven by Miranda Barbour, 19 years old. Her husband, Elite Barbour, was hidden in the back seat. What was supposed to be a transaction would end with Troy LaFerrara losing his life. Miranda drove to a secluded area while Troy was in the passenger seat. Once the vehicle stopped, Elite emerged from the back seat. Troy was struck repeatedly and did not survive the attack. His body was discovered in the vehicle shortly after. The Barbours fled the scene but were quickly identified through Troy's phone records and the Craigslist communication trail. The investigation moved rapidly once Troy's body was found. Police traced his last communications and movements, which led them directly to the Craigslist posting Miranda had created. Phone records showed the messages between them and confirmed the meeting time and location. Police located Miranda and Elite within days. During interrogation, both provided statements about what had occurred. Miranda claimed they had committed the act for thrill-seeking purposes. She stated this was not about robbery or any conventional motive, but rather about the experience itself. Miranda then made an extraordinary claim. She said Troy was not her first victim. She told investigators she had taken at least 22 lives across different locations. She provided details about her supposed history. The claims generated immediate national media attention. News outlets reported on Miranda's supposed history, and the story took on sensational proportions. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states investigated Miranda's claims. They examined unsolved cases in areas where she said she had been active. Despite intensive investigation, no evidence was found to support any of the claimed additional victims. Authorities concluded that Miranda's serial claims were fabrications. Why would someone falsely claim to be a serial offender? The psychology behind such false confessions to additional crimes is complex. Some who commit one serious act inflate their history to seem more significant or notorious. Others may be seeking a particular kind of attention or attempting to control the narrative around their case. In Miranda's situation, the false claims generated massive media coverage, but ultimately did not change the legal proceedings against her. Both Miranda and Elite were charged with homicide. The evidence was overwhelming. Troy's phone records connected him to Miranda's Craigslist account. Forensic evidence placed him in their vehicle, and the Barbours' own statements provided clear admissions of what they had done. The prosecution pursued charges based on the murder-for-hire nature of the Craigslist arrangement and the premeditated aspect of hiding Elite in the back seat. Miranda pleaded guilty to second-degree charges to avoid a trial and potential first-degree conviction. In her statement to police, she said, "I remember everything about what happened that night." Her detailed recollection of events, combined with physical evidence, made any defense strategy difficult. The guilty plea was accepted, and she was sentenced. Miranda Barbour received life imprisonment without the possibility of release. Elite received the same sentence. Both remain incarcerated. Troy LaFerrara's family attended the sentencing, providing statements about the loss of their loved one and the senselessness of what had occurred. While Miranda's case involved luring a stranger, the next would occur within a family home. Heather Marie Daoust. In San Diego, California, on February 16, 2007, emergency responders were called to a residence. Rebecca Daoust had sustained severe head trauma from being struck repeatedly with a hammer. Despite medical intervention, she did not survive her injuries. The person responsible was her adopted daughter, Heather Marie Daoust, who was 14 years old at the time. The Daoust family lived in an affluent area of San Diego. Rebecca had adopted Heather, providing her with a stable home. But beneath the surface, significant tensions were building between mother and daughter. Heather and Rebecca had been experiencing tensions in their relationship. Family members later described ongoing conflicts. The conflicts centered on typical teenage issues: rules, expectations, discipline, but had escalated beyond normal disagreements. On the day of the incident, an argument escalated beyond verbal disagreement. The specific trigger for the final confrontation was not made entirely clear in court proceedings, but witnesses indicated it followed a pattern of increasingly heated exchanges. Heather retrieved a hammer from elsewhere in the home and used it to strike Rebecca multiple times. The attack occurred in a common area of the house where Rebecca had no opportunity to escape or defend herself effectively. The attack was discovered when other family members or emergency services arrived at the scene. Heather was present when authorities responded. She provided statements to investigators about what had occurred. During questioning, she reportedly said, "I just snapped," suggesting the attack stemmed from a loss of control during their conflict. This characterization of spontaneous rage would be challenged by other evidence discovered during investigation. Investigation revealed that Heather had been searching the internet for information about lethal household items. These searches had occurred before the day of Rebecca's passing, indicating that Heather had been considering methods of causing serious harm. The timing and nature of these searches suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous act during an argument. The specific search terms included queries about how much force was needed to cause fatal injuries and which common household objects could be used as weapons. Computer forensics experts examined Heather's internet history and found the searches dated back days or possibly weeks before the actual attack. This timeline contradicted her claim of snapping in the moment. The searches suggested she had been contemplating harming Rebecca and had been researching how to do so effectively. Whether these were idle, dark thoughts that eventually became action or concrete planning remained a question. But the existence of the searches was damning evidence of premeditation. Forensic analysis of the scene confirmed the weapon used and the nature of the injuries. Medical examiners determined Rebecca had been struck multiple times with significant force. The repeated nature of the strikes indicated sustained action rather than a single blow in the heat of the moment. Heather was charged as a juvenile initially, but faced serious consequences due to the severity of what had occurred. Her defense presented information about family dynamics and Heather's psychological state. However, the prosecution focused on the premeditation evidenced by the internet searches and the deliberate nature of obtaining and using the hammer. Heather eventually entered a guilty plea to second-degree charges. The plea avoided a trial where additional details would have been presented publicly. By accepting responsibility through the plea, Heather received a sentence rather than facing the uncertainty of a jury verdict. She was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison. The sentence structure meant she would serve a minimum term before becoming eligible for parole consideration. At that point, a board would evaluate whether she should be released or continue serving time. This type of sentence is common in cases involving juveniles, balancing accountability with the recognition that young people can change over extended periods. Heather remains incarcerated, serving her sentence and awaiting potential parole hearings in the future. Her case illustrates how childhood trauma, family conflicts, and psychological issues can converge, though millions of people experience similar difficulties without resorting to harming others. From a mother-daughter conflict to a mother-daughter relationship destroyed over a boyfriend. Rachel Malenicz. In Evansville, Indiana, in September 2006, Barbara Malenicz disappeared. Her daughter Rachel, 17 years old, reported her mother missing. Rachel claimed Barbara had left for work and never returned. Police began searching for Barbara, interviewing family members, and checking her usual locations. The initial missing person investigation treated Barbara's disappearance as potentially voluntary, though family members insisted she would never leave without contact. Barbara worked a regular job and had established routines. Her sudden disappearance without taking personal items was immediately concerning. Police canvassed her workplace and checked financial records. Nothing indicated Barbara had simply left town. 2 weeks later, Barbara's body was discovered in the Ohio River. She had been placed in a large container and dumped into the water. Medical examination revealed Barbara had been attacked with a weapon, sustaining numerous injuries, 52 separate wounds. The vicious nature of the attack indicated rage rather than a quick act. Investigators interviewed Rachel again, this time with more suspicion. Her story about Barbara leaving for work began to unravel as inconsistencies emerged. Phone records and witness statements contradicted Rachel's timeline. Police also learned about conflicts between Rachel and Barbara regarding Rachel's boyfriend, Ian Allen. The timeline Rachel provided did not match when Barbara was last confirmed to be alive by independent witnesses. Barbara had disapproved of the relationship and had grounded Rachel to restrict her contact with Ian. This disciplinary action had created significant tension in the household. Rachel resented the restrictions and wanted freedom to continue her relationship without interference. Text messages between Rachel and Ian showed discussions about the grounding and expressed frustration about Barbara's rules. Under continued questioning, Rachel eventually confessed to what had happened. She and Ian had been present when Barbara was attacked. The assault occurred in the family home, not at Barbara's workplace as Rachel had initially claimed. After Barbara was ended, Rachel and Ian faced the problem of concealing what they had done. They spent hours deciding how to dispose of the body and clean the scene. They placed Barbara's body in a large plastic container. They then transported the container to the Ohio River and pushed it into the water, hoping it would sink and Barbara would never be found. However, the container surfaced, and Barbara's body was discovered, leading to the investigation that ultimately resulted in Rachel's confession. Forensic evidence from the vehicle used to transport the container linked both Rachel and Ian to the disposal. During the attack, Rachel reportedly said, "I love you, Mom," while Barbara was being harmed. This statement, if accurate, reflected the complex emotional state during the incident, simultaneously expressing affection while participating in lethal action. The psychological contradictions in such moments are difficult to comprehend. Both Rachel and Ian were charged with homicide. The prosecution pursued first-degree charges, arguing the attack was premeditated. The number of wounds Barbara sustained and the actions taken to conceal her body supported the argument that this was planned rather than spontaneous. Rachel was convicted of first-degree charges after trial. The jury heard evidence about the mother-daughter conflicts, the boyfriend situation, and the detailed forensic information about Barbara's injuries. The disposal of the body in the river demonstrated consciousness of guilt and an attempt to evade responsibility. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The sentence meant she would serve a minimum of 25 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. Ian Allen received a similar sentence for his role in what occurred. Rachel's brother has spoken publicly about the case. He described the difficulty of losing his mother and grappling with his sister's responsibility for that loss. He emphasized that Barbara was a caring mother who was simply trying to parent appropriately by setting boundaries for her teenage daughter. As of 2026, Rachel Mullenix remains incarcerated in an Indiana correctional facility. Despite several petitions for sentence modification, her 35-year sentence, with a significant minimum required, has not yet resulted in her release. Her earliest possible release date is currently listed as being several years in the future. While Rachel's conviction was never seriously contested, the next case involves ongoing claims of wrongful conviction. Shanda Crane. In Kentucky in May 2000, George and Bobby Spears were found deceased in their home. Both had been shot. Their daughter Shanda Crane, 22 years old, became the focus of investigation. She had been living with her parents and was present in the home around the time of their passings. Initial investigation focused on whether someone had broken into the home or whether this was a domestic situation. There was no evidence of forced entry. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. These factors pointed investigators toward looking at people who had access to the home. Police questioned Shanda extensively. During interrogation, she provided statements that prosecutors later used as a confession. However, Shonda has consistently maintained that this statement was coerced. She claims investigators pressured her into saying things that were not true. The interrogation lasted many hours. Shonda was questioned without an attorney present initially. Investigators used standard techniques, including presenting scenarios and asking Shonda to explain how events might have unfolded. At some point during this process, Shonda made statements that could be interpreted as admitting involvement or knowledge of what happened. Defense attorneys later argued these statements came after hours of pressure, when Shonda was exhausted and traumatized. Shonda was charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide. The prosecution's case relied heavily on her statement to police and circumstantial evidence about her presence in the home. The alleged motive centered on family disputes and potential inheritance issues, though concrete evidence of these motives was limited. Prosecutors suggested Shonda stood to gain financially from her parents' passings, though the family's financial situation was not substantial. The motive theory had holes. George and Bobby were not wealthy. Their estate consisted primarily of their home and modest savings. Whether this represented enough financial incentive for Shonda to take their lives was questionable. The prosecution relied more on the confession than on establishing a strong motive. The trial proceeded with Shonda maintaining her innocence. Her defense argued the confession was not reliable and that physical evidence did not definitively place her as the perpetrator. However, the jury found the confession and circumstantial evidence sufficient for conviction. The fact that Shonda had been in the home and her own statements to police, even if coerced, created a strong case in the jury's eyes. Shonda was convicted on both counts and sentenced to life without the possibility of release. This sentence meant she would remain incarcerated for the rest of her life, with no opportunity for parole hearings. For someone maintaining innocence, this outcome was particularly severe. She had no avenue to demonstrate rehabilitation or argue for release based on changed circumstances. Since her conviction, Shonda has pursued multiple legal avenues to challenge her case. She has filed appeals arguing that her confession was improperly obtained and that her trial contained errors. These appeals have been unsuccessful in overturning her conviction. Appellate courts reviewed the trial record and found no reversible errors, despite questions about the interrogation methods used. She has also sought clemency from Kentucky governors, requesting that her sentence be commuted or that she be granted a new trial. Georgetown University's Prisons and Justice Initiative has taken interest in Shonda's case. They have examined the circumstances of her confession and the evidence presented at trial. Their involvement suggests they believe there are legitimate questions about the conviction, though they have not succeeded in obtaining her release or a new trial. Shonda continues to state, "I didn't do it," when asked about the charges against her. Her pursuit of clemency and exoneration has been ongoing since her conviction. Shonda Crane was released from prison in late 2022 after being granted clemency by Governor Andy Beshear. Her case was a high-profile example of a conviction overturned due to the recognition of a coerced confession and the lack of physical evidence linking her to her parents' deaths. The case presents questions about confession reliability, interrogation techniques, and how wrongful convictions might occur. If Shonda's claims are accurate, she represents someone serving life imprisonment for crimes she did not commit. If the conviction was appropriate, she represents someone who refuses to accept responsibility for taking her parents' lives. From a contested conviction to a case where responsibility was never in doubt. Ashley Jones. In Mobile, Alabama, on August 5, 1999, emergency responders arrived at a home after reports of attacks. They found a scene of significant carnage. DeRoy Knowles, a grandfather, and Millie Knowles, an aunt, had both been ended. Other family members in the home had also been targeted, but survived. The perpetrators were Ashley Jones, 14 years old, and her boyfriend, Jeremy Hart. The Knowles family home had been a place where multiple generations gathered. DeRoy was the patriarch, and Millie was a beloved aunt. Ashley had been living in the home under her family's supervision. The family had concerns about Ashley's relationship with Jeremy. Ashley and Jeremy had been in a relationship that Ashley's family disapproved of. The family's objections and attempts to keep the teenagers apart had created conflict. Rather than accepting the family's authority, Ashley and Jeremy decided to eliminate those standing in their way. The plan involved entering the home and attacking multiple family members. Whether they intended to eliminate everyone present or had specific targets remained unclear, but the violence was indiscriminate once it began. Ashley's grandfather, DeRoy, was targeted first, sustaining fatal injuries. He was an elderly man with no ability to defend himself against two younger attackers. The attack on him was brutal and quick. Her Aunt Millie was also attacked and did not survive. Millie had been particularly vocal about her concerns regarding Ashley's relationship with Jeremy. She had advocated for strict supervision and restrictions. In the twisted logic of the attackers, this made her a primary target. Ashley's sister was present during the attacks and was also targeted, but managed to survive her injuries. During the assault on her sister, Ashley reportedly said, "I have to kill you. I don't want to, but I have to," reflecting the internal conflict often seen in folie à deux, shared psychosis, cases involving a controlling partner. This statement, delivered while attempting to end her sister's life, demonstrated the cold determination with which Ashley approached what she was doing. The sister survived despite sustaining serious injuries, 14 separate wounds. She would later testify about the attacks and about Ashley's demeanor during the incident. The sister's survival provided crucial testimony for prosecution. She could describe what happened, who did what, and what was said. Her account made it impossible for Ashley or Jeremy to claim the attacks were accidental or that someone else was responsible. The survivor was a direct witness who could contradict any defense narrative. Law enforcement responded to the scene and began investigating immediately. Ashley and Jeremy were identified quickly as the perpetrators. They provided statements about what had occurred, and physical evidence at the scene corroborated their involvement. There was no question about who was responsible for the attacks. The forensic evidence included fingerprints, blood patterns, and the weapons used in the attacks. The motive centered on Ashley's desire for freedom to continue her relationship with Jeremy without family interference. The family's attempts to separate the teenagers or impose restrictions had led Ashley and Jeremy to conclude that removing family members was the solution. This reasoning showed a fundamental inability to accept parental authority and boundaries. Rather than waiting until Ashley was legally an adult or working within the system, they chose violence. Both Ashley and Jeremy were charged with capital offenses due to the multiple victims and the aggravated circumstances. Alabama law allowed for serious charges against juveniles in cases of this severity. The prosecution pursued the highest charges available given the facts of the case. Ashley was convicted after trial. The jury heard testimony about the attacks, saw forensic evidence, and considered Ashley's own statements about what happened. The evidence was overwhelming, and the defense had little to work with beyond arguing for mitigation based on Ashley's youth. Following the Supreme Court ruling in Miller v. Alabama, Ashley Jones was resentenced and made eligible for parole. While she was denied parole in her most recent hearing in late 2024, she is no longer serving a sentence that precludes the possibility of release. Ashley's case raised questions about juvenile justice and appropriate sentences for minors who commit serious offenses. Some argued that no teenagers should receive life without release, as young people have capacity for change and rehabilitation. Others pointed to the severity of what Ashley did, taking 2 lives and attempting to take more, as justifying permanent incarceration regardless of her age at the time. The surviving family members, particularly Ashley's sister who was targeted in the attacks, have had to process the trauma of that night and the loss of their loved ones. They lost DeRoy and Millie, and in a different sense, lost Ashley to prison for the rest of her life. While Ashley targeted her own family, the next case involved targeting a romantic rival's spouse, Catherine Bellflower. In Livermore, California, in December 2003, a woman named Jenna Simons was reported missing. Her body was later discovered in an irrigation canal. She had been shot with a shotgun. The investigation would reveal that Catherine Bellflower, 17 years old, had been involved in a relationship with Jenna's husband, Michael Simons. Catherine and Michael had been having an affair. They wanted to be together, but faced the obstacle of Michael's marriage to Jenna. Rather than pursuing divorce or simply ending their affair, they decided to eliminate Jenna. This decision was motivated in part by financial considerations. Jenna had life insurance that would pay out to Michael if she passed. The policy was for a substantial amount, enough to provide financial security for Michael and Catherine if they could collect it. The affair had been going on for months before the planning began. Michael was significantly older than Catherine, creating a power dynamic. Whether Catherine would have contemplated such action on her own remained a question. What is clear is that both participated in planning Jenna's ending. The plan involved luring Jenna to a remote location. Catherine participated in getting Jenna to the slough area where the shooting would occur. Jenna trusted her husband and would have had no reason to suspect danger. Once Jenna was in the location, she was shot. Her body was left at the scene but was discovered during investigation into her disappearance. The remote location suggested the killers hoped the body might not be found for some time, giving them opportunity to establish alibis and collect the insurance money before investigators became suspicious. Police interviewed Michael and Catherine as part of their investigation into Jenna's disappearance and subsequent discovery. Inconsistencies in their accounts and evidence connecting them to the crime scene led to their arrests. Phone records showed extensive communication between Michael and Catherine in the days leading up to Jenna's passing. Financial records showed Michael had been researching the insurance policy and its payout terms. A third person, who had been involved in some aspects of the planning, was also arrested. This individual had provided assistance or had knowledge of what was going to happen, but may not have been present at the actual ending. Their involvement demonstrated that Michael and Catherine had discussed their plans with at least one other person, creating witnesses to their conspiracy. During investigation, authorities learned that there had been a previous attempt on another person connected to the situation. This earlier incident provided context for the eventual attack on Jenna, showing that the conspirators had been willing to harm others to achieve their goals. The previous attempt had not succeeded, but it demonstrated a pattern of planning and willingness to use lethal force. Catherine faced charges for her role in Jenna's ending. The prosecution presented evidence about the affair with Michael, the financial motive regarding insurance, and Catherine's participation in the planning and execution of the crime. Phone records, witness statements, and forensic evidence all pointed to Catherine's involvement. Catherine entered a guilty plea rather than going to trial. By pleading guilty, she accepted responsibility for what had occurred and avoided the uncertainty of a jury trial. The plea likely also resulted in a somewhat reduced sentence compared to what she might have received if convicted at trial of the highest charges. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. This sentence structure meant Catherine would serve a minimum of 25 years before becoming eligible for parole consideration. At that point, a parole board would evaluate whether she should be released or continue serving time. Michael Simons was convicted and sentenced to life in prison for his central role in planning and carrying out Jenna's ending. He received a harsher sentence than Catherine, reflecting his greater culpability as the married individual who initiated the affair and stood to gain financially from his wife's insurance policy. For Jenna Simons's family, the trial and sentencing provided some measure of justice, but could not restore what they had lost. Jenna had been eliminated by her husband and his teenage girlfriend so they could be together and collect insurance money. The calculating nature of the crime made processing the loss even more difficult. Catherine's case illustrates how romantic entanglements can lead to terrible decisions, particularly when coupled with financial motives and the influence of an older partner. At 17, Catherine was still maturing mentally and emotionally, yet she participated in planning and executing an act that would destroy multiple lives. from a case involving romantic motives to one involving theft. Ruth Ann Veal. In Des Moines, Iowa, on December 21, 1993, Catherine Haynes was working at the Beaverdale Public Library. That evening, she was attacked inside the library and sustained multiple stab wounds. Catherine did not survive. The perpetrator was Ruth Ann Veal, 13 years old at the time. Catherine was alone in the library during the evening shift. Whether Ruth Ann came with a specific intention of targeting Catherine, or whether the decision was made spontaneously once inside remained unclear. What was clear was that Ruth Ann brought a weapon with her. The attack appeared to be motivated by robbery. Ruth Ann had gone to the library and at some point decided to take items or money from Catherine. When Catherine resisted, or when the situation escalated, Ruth Ann used a weapon she had brought. Money from the library was missing after the incident. Law enforcement responded to the scene and began investigating. Evidence at the library pointed to Ruth Ann's involvement. She was identified, located, and questioned. During interrogation, Ruth Ann provided statements about what had occurred. She reportedly said, "I didn't mean to," when discussing Catherine's passing, suggesting she had not intended for the situation to escalate to that point. However, the fact that Ruth Ann had brought a weapon to the library indicated some level of planning. Whether she intended to use it when she arrived or brought it for intimidation purposes became a question during legal proceedings. The prosecution argued that bringing a weapon showed premeditation of serious action, while the defense emphasized Ruth Ann's youth and suggested the situation had spiraled beyond her control. The "I didn't mean to" statement could be interpreted multiple ways. Perhaps Ruth Ann meant she didn't intend to take a life, but only to rob. Perhaps she meant the attack was more severe than she intended. Or perhaps she was expressing regret for what had occurred. The statement did not negate her responsibility, but did provide some insight into her mental state after the fact. Ruth Ann was charged with first-degree offenses due to the circumstances of Catherine's ending. Iowa law allowed for serious charges against juveniles in appropriate cases. Given the library setting, the victim's status as someone simply doing her job, and the use of a weapon, prosecutors pursued the highest charges available. The fact that this occurred during a robbery also added to the severity of charges. Ruth Ann was convicted after proceedings that considered both the evidence against her and her status as a minor. She was originally sentenced to life in prison. However, as understanding of juvenile brain development evolved and legal standards changed regarding life sentences for minors, her case was revisited. Supreme Court decisions in the years following her conviction established that mandatory life sentences for juveniles violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Ruth Ann was eventually resentenced to 35 years. This new sentence reflected evolving legal standards about appropriate punishments for crimes committed by juveniles. The resentencing acknowledged that while what Ruth Ann did was serious, keeping her in prison for life without considering her youth at the time of the offense was excessive. After serving significant time, Ruth Ann became eligible for parole and was eventually released. The parole board determined she had served sufficient time and no longer posed a threat to public safety. Her release allowed her to re-enter society after more than 2 decades in prison. Ruth Ann Veal was released on parole in 2018 after her mandatory life sentence was ruled unconstitutional. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. While Ruth Ann's parole was revoked, the next case would involve a love triangle that turned deadly. Rachel Wade. In Pinellas Park, Florida, a rivalry between 2 young women escalated throughout 2009. Rachel Wade, 19 years old, and Sarah Ludman, 18, were both involved with the same man, Joshua Camacho. The conflict between them played out through text messages, phone calls, and social media. The hostility between the two grew increasingly intense over months, with threats exchanged and confrontations occurring. The situation escalated from verbal conflict to something far more serious. One voicemail message Rachel left for Sarah was particularly threatening. In the recording, Rachel said she would murder Sarah. This message would later become crucial evidence in establishing Rachel's state of mind and intentions. The explicit nature of the threat showed this was not idle talk, but rather a stated willingness to cause serious harm. On April 14, 2009, the conflict came to a head when Sarah and friends drove to where Rachel was located. A face-to-face encounter occurred in the early morning hours. Rachel was carrying a knife. During the confrontation, Rachel stabbed Sarah in the chest. The single wound penetrated Sarah's heart. Sarah did not survive. Rachel remained at the scene and was arrested shortly after. Rachel initially claimed self-defense. She stated that Sarah and her friends had come looking for her, that she felt threatened, and that she had the knife for protection. Rachel argued she had not intended to take Sarah's life, but had acted in fear for her own safety. This defense strategy would face significant challenges given the evidence of Rachel's prior threats. The investigation focused heavily on the electronic communications between Rachel and Sarah. Text messages and voicemails documented months of escalating hostility. The messages showed both sides making threats and expressing anger. However, Rachel's messages were particularly aggressive and included specific threats of physical harm. The voicemail, where Rachel threatened to murder Sarah, became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Jurors could hear Rachel's voice making this explicit threat. The recording contradicted her self-defense claim because it showed she had contemplated taking Sarah's life before the confrontation occurred. If she had been planning such action, the argument that she acted purely in self-defense during a spontaneous encounter became less credible. Witnesses who were present during the confrontation provided testimony about what had occurred. Their accounts generally supported the prosecution's version of events, that Rachel had been the aggressor and that Sarah had not posed an immediate deadly threat when Rachel stabbed her. The witnesses described Rachel as confrontational rather than fearful. Forensic evidence examined the nature of Sarah's wound. Medical examiners testified about the force required to inflict such an injury and the location of the wound. The testimony suggested this was not a defensive action, but rather a deliberate strike aimed at a vital area. The precision and force of the attack contradicted Rachel's claim that she was simply trying to protect herself. Rachel was charged with second-degree offenses. The prosecution argued that while Rachel may not have planned that specific night to take Sarah's life, her prior threats and decision to carry a knife showed a reckless disregard for human life. The second-degree charge reflected that Rachel had acted with implied malice, even if she had not engaged in premeditated planning. The trial received significant media attention due to the love triangle aspect and the ages of those involved. The case was covered extensively on true crime shows and news outlets. The voicemail recording was played repeatedly in media coverage, shocking audiences with its explicit threat. Rachel was convicted after trial. The jury rejected her self-defense claim, finding that the evidence showed Rachel had been the aggressor and had taken Sarah's life not in defense, but in anger over their rivalry. The conviction on second-degree charges meant Rachel faced a substantial prison sentence. She was sentenced to 27 years in prison. The sentence reflected both the severity of what Rachel had done and her age at the time. While 27 years was a lengthy sentence, it was less than what she might have received if convicted of first-degree charges. Rachel would be in her mid-40s before becoming eligible for release. Joshua Camacho, the man both women had been involved with, testified during the trial. His testimony provided context for the rivalry, but did not excuse what Rachel had done. The fact that two young women had been fighting over romantic involvement with him became part of the broader discussion about the case, though ultimately Rachel's responsibility for her own actions remained the focus. For Sarah Ludemann's family, the trial provided some measure of justice, but could not restore what they had lost. Sarah had been 18 years old with her life ahead of her. She had been caught up in a rivalry that escalated beyond anything reasonable, ending with her death over a romantic conflict. In 2025, Rachel's case received renewed media attention. Court TV and other outlets featured retrospectives asking whether Rachel would finally come clean about what happened. These programs revisited the self-defense claim and the evidence that contradicted it. The renewed coverage kept the case in public consciousness more than 15 years after Sarah's passing. Under Florida's 85% rule for violent offenses, Rachel Wade, who was sentenced in 2010 to 27 years, is projected for release in May 2033, assuming she maintains all earned gain time for good behavior. Whether she will be released when eligible or required to serve additional time will depend on parole board evaluations of her rehabilitation and risk to public safety. From a love triangle to a case involving a daughter hiring someone to target her own mother. Jermaine Lewis. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, a woman named Markesia Stone was shot outside her home in April 2022. She did not survive her injuries. Investigation revealed that her daughter, Jermaine Lewis, 16 years old, had hired someone to carry out the shooting. The person Jermaine hired, Dwayne Barfield, also 16, was identified as the shooter. The relationship between Jermaine and her mother had been troubled. Family issues had created tension in the household, though the specific nature of the conflicts was not extensively detailed in public records. Whatever the sources of tension, they led Jermaine to the extreme decision to arrange for her mother's ending. The choice to hire someone rather than act directly suggested both planning and an attempt to create distance from the actual act. Jermaine and Dwayne communicated online about the plan. They discussed the logistics of when and where the shooting would occur. The digital trail of their conversations would later provide prosecutors with clear evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. Text messages and social media communications documented that Jermaine had asked Dwayne to carry out the act and that he had agreed. On the day of the shooting, Markesia was outside her home when Dwayne approached and shot her. The attack occurred in daylight in a residential area. Markesia was transported to a hospital but succumbed to her injuries. Young people were present in the home at the time, witnessing or hearing the attack. The trauma inflicted on these witnesses added another layer of harm to an already devastating situation. They lost their mother and had to process that the attack had been arranged by their sibling. Investigation moved quickly once police identified the shooter. Dwayne was arrested and during interrogation confessed to shooting Markesia. Crucially, he also revealed that Jermaine had hired him to do it. His confession implicated Jermaine as the person who planned and arranged the attack. Without his testimony, investigators might have struggled to connect Jermaine to the shooting. The digital evidence corroborated Dwayne's account. Police examined phones and social media accounts, finding the conversations between Jermaine and Dwayne about planning the attack. The messages left no doubt that Jermaine had orchestrated what happened. The electronic record provided prosecutors with a clear narrative of premeditation and intent. Both Jermaine and Dwayne were charged with serious offenses. Dwayne faced charges as the actual shooter. Jermaine was charged as the principal or mastermind behind the attack. Under Louisiana law, someone who hires or arranges for another person to commit a serious act can be charged as if they committed the act themselves. Jermaine Lewis was convicted by a jury in Mansfield, Texas, in February and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 found deceased in their home. Her mother, Markesia Stone, was killed on April 23, 2022, in a plot Lewis orchestrated via encrypted social media messages. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The sentence structure reflected both the severity of arranging her mother's ending and her age at the time of the offense. Louisiana law allows for parole consideration for juvenile offenders after serving a minimum term. Jermaine will not be eligible for parole hearings until she has served at least 25 years. The sentence means Jermaine will be in her 40s before she can even be considered for release. Whether she will actually be paroled at that point will depend on numerous factors, including her behavior in prison, her acceptance of responsibility, and evaluations of whether she poses a risk to public safety. Dwayne Barfield also faced serious consequences for his role. As the person who actually carried out the shooting, he was sentenced for his direct participation. His sentence reflected that while Germain had arranged the attack, he had made the choice to agree to it and to pull the trigger. For Markeisha Stone's surviving family members, the case presented the dual trauma of losing her and learning that her own daughter had arranged it. The young people who witnessed or were present during the attack now had to grow up knowing their sister had hired someone to shoot their mother. The family bonds were shattered not just by the passing itself, but by the betrayal inherent in who was responsible. While Germain hired someone to act, the next case involved a young woman who masterminded attacks on her boyfriend's parents. Chelsea Richardson. In Mansfield, Texas, in February 2003, Rick and Susanna Walmsley were found deceased in their home. Both had been attacked in an extremely brutal manner. The investigation revealed that their son's girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, 19 years old, had orchestrated the attacks. Chelsea had enlisted her boyfriend Andrew and another individual, Susana Toledano, to carry out what she had planned. Rick and Susanna had concerns about their son's relationship with Chelsea. They did not approve of the relationship and had expressed their objections. This parental disapproval created tension between Chelsea and the Walmsleys. Rather than accepting that parents might have legitimate concerns or simply waiting until Andrew was independent, Chelsea decided to remove them as obstacles. The motive appeared to be both eliminating opposition to the relationship and gaining access to inheritance. The Walmsleys had assets that would pass to Andrew upon their passing. Chelsea apparently believed that with Rick and Susanna gone, she and Andrew would have both freedom and financial resources. This combination of personal animosity and financial gain drove Chelsea's planning. What made the case particularly disturbing was that this was not the first attempt. Chelsea had previously tried to arrange for the Walmsleys to be harmed, but those attempts had failed. She persisted until finally succeeding in February 2006. The multiple attempts showed determination and a willingness to keep trying until she achieved her goal. On the night of the attacks, Andrew and Susanna entered the Walmsley home. Rick and Susanna were subjected to a prolonged assault. The nature of what was done to them reflected extreme violence. After the attacks, the perpetrators attempted to stage the scene to appear as a home invasion or robbery gone wrong. However, investigators quickly saw through this staging. The level of personal animosity evident in how Rick and Susanna had been treated suggested this was not a random crime. The targeting of the home and the specific victims pointed towards someone with a personal connection. Investigation focused on people close to the family. Andrew's relationship with Chelsea and Chelsea's known conflicts with his parents made her a natural focus. When questioned, the participants eventually provided information that implicated Chelsea as the mastermind. Susana Toledano and Andrew both gave statements describing how Chelsea had planned the attacks and recruited them to carry it out. All three were charged with capital offenses. Texas law allowed for the maximum charges given the circumstances. Multiple victims, the brutal nature of the attacks, and the calculated planning involved. The prosecution pursued the highest charges available. Chelsea Richardson was convicted after trial. The evidence against her was substantial. The testimony from Andrew and Susanna, the evidence of prior attempts, and the clear motive all pointed to Chelsea as the person who had orchestrated everything. The jury found her guilty of capital offenses. She was sentenced to execution. Chelsea became one of the women on Texas's death row. However, she would not remain there permanently. Years later, as legal standards evolved regarding certain aspects of capital cases, Chelsea's sentence was reconsidered. In 2012, Chelsea's sentence was changed from execution to life imprisonment. The resentencing did not reflect innocence or a determination that she was less culpable than originally thought. Rather, it reflected changes in how certain cases were evaluated for capital punishment. The new sentence of life imprisonment meant Chelsea would remain incarcerated but would not face execution. Chelsea Richardson remains in prison serving life imprisonment. She has no possibility of parole under her sentence. Andrew and Susana Toledano also received lengthy sentences for their participation, though as the individuals who actually carried out Chelsea's plan, their sentences reflected different considerations than hers as the mastermind. The Walmsley family lost both Rick and Susana to attacks arranged by someone who wanted their son's inheritance. The betrayal by Andrew, who participated in attacks on his own parents at Chelsea's direction, compounded the tragedy. Extended family members had to process not just the violent ending of Rick and Susana, but also Andrew's participation in their passing. From multiple failed attempts to a single hired hitman case. Amy Lynn Priesmeyer. In California in December 1997, a man named Ricky Cowles Jr. was found beaten and shot in his apartment in August 1997. The investigation revealed that his girlfriend, Amy Lynn Priesmeyer, 16 years old, had hired someone to carry out the attack. The person Amy hired, a man she found willing to commit such an act, had carried out Amy's plan in exchange for $250. Amy had been in a relationship with Ricky but was facing an issue. She was pregnant. Rather than dealing with this situation through conventional means, Amy decided the solution was to eliminate Ricky. Her reasoning appeared to center on not wanting to deal with the responsibilities and complications that would come with having his offspring. Rather than ending the relationship or making other choices, she chose to hire someone to take his life. The amount she paid, $250, reflected both the value she placed on the act and what she believed someone would accept for such work. Finding someone willing to take a life for such a small amount suggested Amy had contact with people in desperate financial situations or involved in criminal activities. The hitman she hired was not a professional, but rather someone motivated by immediate financial need. The attack on Ricky was brutal. He was beaten and then shot. The combination of methods suggested either the hitman was ensuring Ricky would not survive, or that the attack involved more personal anger than a simple execution would entail. Ricky's body was discovered, and the investigation into who was responsible began. The breakthrough came when the hitman's girlfriend contacted police with information. She knew what her boyfriend had done and that Amy had hired him. Her tip provided investigators with the key to solving Ricky's case. Without her coming forward, connecting Amy to the attack would have been significantly more difficult. Police arrested both hitman and Amy. During interrogation, the hitman confirmed that Amy had hired him and paid him $250. He provided details about how Amy had approached him, what she had requested, and how the payment had been arranged. His testimony gave prosecutors a clear narrative of Amy's role in planning and financing the attack. Amy was charged with serious offenses as the person who had arranged for Ricky's ending. California law treated her as the principal in the crime, even though she had not physically carried out the attack. The person who hires or arranges for another to commit such an act bears full responsibility as if they had acted directly. The prosecution presented evidence about Amy's pregnancy, her relationship with Ricky, and her conversations with the hitman. The motive was clear. Amy wanted to eliminate Ricky to avoid dealing with the pregnancy and the responsibilities that would follow. The $250 payment was documented through witness testimony. The case against Amy was straightforward and compelling. Amy Lynn Priesmeyer was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the calculated nature of hiring someone to take a life and the young age of the victim. Amy would spend the rest of her life incarcerated for the decision she made at 16 years old. From prison, Amy has written about her experiences and reflections. In an August 2025 piece published through Prison Writers, she discussed solitary confinement and expressed regrets about her past. Her writing suggests she has had time to contemplate the choices she made and their consequences. However, writing from prison cannot undo what happened to Ricky Cowles Jr. In December 2025, Amy underwent a parole suitability hearing. The hearing was conducted under California Penal Code provisions that allow for parole consideration in certain cases. The parole board found Priesmeyer suitable in late 2024. Governor Gavin Newsom reversed that grant of parole in January 2025, and she remains in prison as of 2026. From a hired attack to a case involving direct action on a holiday. Delilah Sherwood Evans. In Clinton Township, Michigan, on Christmas Day 2016, emergency responders were called to a residence. Inside, they found Sonia Ryang deceased from what medical examiners would determine to be 120 stab wounds. The person responsible was her daughter, Delilah Sherwood Evans, who was 16 years old at the time. Sonia Ryang was disabled and required assistance with daily activities. She depended on family members, including Delilah, for care and support. This dependency created a situation where Sonia was particularly vulnerable to those who were supposed to be caring for her. The relationship between caregiver and person receiving care requires trust, and that trust was catastrophically violated in this case. Delilah was found at the scene when police arrived. She provided statements to investigators about what had occurred. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Sonia's injuries and Delilah's presence at the scene left no doubt about who was responsible. The question was not who had done this, but rather why and what circumstances had led to such extreme action. The number of wounds, 120, indicated a sustained attack. Medical examiners testified that such extensive injuries represented continued action far beyond what would have been necessary. The attack appeared to involve either rage or a complete loss of control. Investigation examined Delilah's mental health history and state of mind. Psychological evaluations were conducted to assess her mental state both at the time of the attack and currently. These evaluations would become important in determining how the legal system would address her case. The question of mental illness and its role in what happened became central to understanding Delilah's actions. Delilah was charged with serious offenses. Given the severity of Sonia's injuries and the vulnerable nature of the victim, prosecutors pursued the highest charges available. The fact that Sonia had been disabled and dependent on Delilah for care was considered an aggravating factor. Someone who harms a person under their care violates a fundamental trust. During legal proceedings, Delilah was found guilty but mentally ill. This verdict acknowledged that while Delilah was responsible for what happened to Sonia, her mental illness played a role in her actions. The guilty but mentally ill verdict is distinct from both a standard guilty verdict and a not guilty by reason of insanity verdict. It means the person is held criminally responsible, but mental health treatment should be part of their incarceration. Following Michigan's resentencing laws for juveniles, Delilah Evans was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, making her first eligible for a hearing in 2056. The sentence reflected the severity of what Delilah had done to her disabled mother. The guilty but mentally ill finding meant that while incarcerated, Delilah would have access to mental health treatment, but she would not be released based on mental health considerations. She would remain in prison for the rest of her life. The life without parole sentence for a 16-year-old raised questions about juvenile justice. Some argued that no person that young should receive a sentence that eliminates all possibility of eventual release. Others pointed to the extreme nature of what Delilah did, 120 stab wounds to her disabled mother, as justifying permanent incarceration regardless of her age. For Sonia Ryang's family, the loss was compounded by the circumstances. Sonia had been vulnerable and dependent on care. She had been harmed by her own daughter on Christmas Day. The brutality of the attack, evidenced by the sheer number of wounds, made processing the loss especially difficult. No explanation could make sense of why someone would inflict such extensive harm on their disabled mother. While Delilah's case involved a disabled victim, the next would involve inheritance as a motive. Amber Mary Bray. In San Diego County, California, in January 16, 1996, a woman named Dixie Lee Hollier was found deceased. She had been shot twice and stabbed 24 times. The investigation revealed that Dixie's daughter, Amber Mary Bray, 18 years old, and Amber's boyfriend, Jeffrey Ayers, had been responsible for the attack. The motive appeared to be financial. Dixie had assets that would pass to Amber upon her passing. Dixie Hollier had been in a relationship that Amber did not approve of. There were conflicts between Dixie and Amber about various aspects of Dixie's life and choices. Beyond these personal conflicts, the financial consideration appeared to be significant. Amber and Jeffrey apparently believed that, with Dixie gone, Amber would inherit, and they would have access to money and property. The decision to act came in early 1998. Amber and Jeffrey planned how they would carry out the attack. They chose methods that would ensure Dixie did not survive, combining shooting and stabbing. The dual method suggested either they wanted to be absolutely certain or that the attack involved more rage than cold calculation would require. On the day of Dixie's ending, Amber and Jeffrey went to where Dixie was and carried out their plan. Dixie was shot twice. After being shot, she was also stabbed 24 times. The combination of gunshot wounds and multiple stab wounds indicated an extremely violent attack. The stabbing after shooting suggested continued action beyond what the gunshots alone would have accomplished. The crime scene was discovered, and Dixie's body was found with the extensive injuries. Police began investigating who was responsible. Amber and Jeffrey were identified as suspects quickly. Their relationship with Dixie, the financial motive, and evidence connecting them to the scene made them the focus of investigation. Witnesses provided information about Amber and Jeffrey's activities around the time of Dixie's passing. Someone had observed or heard something that pointed toward their involvement. The witness testimony combined with physical evidence from the scene built a strong case against both Amber and Jeffrey. Both were charged with serious offenses. The prosecution presented evidence about the financial motive, the planning that had gone into the attack, and the brutal nature of how Dixie had been ended. The fact that she had been both shot and stabbed extensively showed a level of violence that went beyond a simple plan to eliminate someone for inheritance. The trial focused on establishing that Amber and Jeffrey had acted together to take Dixie's life for financial gain. The prosecution argued that this was calculated action motivated by greed. The defense had limited options given the evidence connecting both defendants to the scene and the clear motive they had. Amber Mary Bray was convicted after trial. The evidence against her was substantial. The jury found that she had participated in planning and carrying out the attack on her mother for inheritance. Jeffrey Ayers was also convicted for his role. Amber was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected both the severity of what she had done and the calculated financial motive behind it. Taking a parent's life for inheritance was seen as particularly callous. The life without parole sentence meant Amber would never be released. Jeffrey Ayers received a similar sentence for his participation. As Amber's boyfriend, who had helped plan and carry out the attack, he bore equal responsibility. Both remain incarcerated serving life sentences. For Dixie Lee Hollier's family, the loss was compounded by knowing that her own daughter had been responsible. Dixie had been ended not by a stranger or in a random crime, but by Amber and Jeffrey acting out of greed. The fact that they were willing to take her life to access inheritance showed a fundamental lack of value for human life compared to material wealth. From inheritance as a motive to a case that would become a national discussion about justice and self-defense. Cyntoia Brown. In Nashville, Tennessee, in August 2004, a man named Johnny Allen was found deceased in his home. He had been shot. The person who shot him was Cyntoia Brown, 16 years old at the time. Cyntoia had been involved in activities where she provided services to men in exchange for money. Johnny Allen had picked her up, brought her to his home, and what happened next would become the subject of intense legal and public debate for more than a decade. Cyntoia claimed that she shot Johnny Allen in self-defense. She stated that Allen had reached for something she believed was a weapon and that she feared for her life. In the moment, believing she was in danger, she took Allen's firearm and shot him. This claim of self-defense would be central to how her case was viewed and whether her actions were justified or criminal. The circumstances leading up to the shooting were complex. Cyntoia was 16 and was being directed by an adult man in engaging in activity for money. This raised questions about whether she was a victim herself, someone being exploited by adults, if she was being controlled or coerced into dangerous situations. Did that affect how her actions should be judged? Police investigated the shooting and interviewed Cyntoia. Her account of what happened included details about fearing for her safety. However, prosecutors saw the case differently. They argued that regardless of the circumstances that brought Cyntoia to Alan's home, she had taken his life in a manner that was not justified self-defense. They pointed to evidence suggesting she had taken items from Alan's home after shooting him, which they argued showed this was robbery rather than self-defense. Cyntoia was charged with serious offenses and tried as an adult despite being 16 at the time. Tennessee law allowed juveniles to be tried as adults in certain serious cases. The prosecution pursued adult charges, arguing that the nature of what had occurred warranted treating Cyntoia as an adult offender. The trial centered on competing narratives. The defense argued Cyntoia was a victim who had acted in self-defense in a dangerous situation. The prosecution argued she was a criminal who had taken someone's life and robbed him. The jury heard testimony about the circumstances, saw evidence from the scene, and had to decide which narrative was accurate. Cyntoia was convicted and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after serving 51 years. The sentence meant she would not be eligible for parole consideration until she was in her late 60s. For someone convicted at 16, this was effectively a life sentence. The harsh sentence reflected both the conviction itself and Tennessee's sentencing laws at that time. Years passed with Cyntoia serving her sentence. Then, her case attracted national attention. Documentary films and media coverage highlighted Cyntoia's story, focusing on her age at the time, the circumstances that led to her being in Alan's home, and questions about whether justice had been served. Celebrities and advocates took up her cause, arguing that she had been a victim who deserved clemency. The publicity created pressure for Tennessee officials to reconsider Cyntoia's case. Advocates argued that a 16-year-old being exploited by adults should not receive a life sentence for acting in what she believed was self-defense. They emphasized her youth, the circumstances of exploitation, and the disproportionate nature of her sentence. In January 2019, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam granted Cyntoia Brown clemency. The clemency decision meant Cyntoia's sentence was commuted to time served. After 15 years in prison, she would be released. The decision came near the end of Governor Haslam's term in office and represented a significant development in a case that had become nationally prominent. Cyntoia Brown was released from prison in August 2019. She had served 15 years for the shooting of Johnny Allen. Her release sparked both celebration from advocates who believed justice had finally been served and criticism from those who believed she should have served more time or her full sentence. Since her release, Cyntoia has become an advocate for criminal justice reform and for victims of exploitation. She has spoken publicly about her experiences and about the need for changes in how the justice system handles cases involving young people who have been exploited. Her case became a symbol in broader discussions about juvenile justice, exploitation, and appropriate sentencing. For Johnny Allen's family, Cyntoia's release represented a painful reminder of their loss. Allen had been shot in his own home, and regardless of the circumstances, they had lost a family member. The clemency decision meant the person who shot him served 15 years rather than the life sentence she had received at trial. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.